The atmosphere inside the sapphire was cold enough to preserve dead tissue, which felt entirely appropriate considering I was about to be surgically removed from the Sterling family dynasty like a cancerous tumour. We were seated in the most exclusive private alcove of the restaurant, surrounded by heavy velvet drapes that muffled the sounds of the other diners, creating a vacuum where the only audible sounds were the clinking of crystal and the low hum of old money congratulating itself. My mother-in-law, Genevieve, sat at the head of the table with the posture of a monarch who had just signed a death warrant, her eyes scanning the room with a predatory sharpness that missed nothing. She had organised this dinner ostensibly to celebrate my 33rd birthday, but the tension radiating from her was so thick it tasted metallic on my tongue. My husband Darius sat to her right, looking less like a successful real estate executive and more like a frightened schoolboy waiting for permission to speak, his hands fidgeting nervously with his linen napkin. Across from me sat my sister-in-law Bianca and her husband Chad, who was already 3 scotches deep and wearing his arrogance like a second skin. They were all waiting for something, a collective breath held in anticipation of my humiliation, and I sat there slicing my steak with surgical precision, refusing to let them see my hands tremble. Chad leaned back in his chair and swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his eyes fixing on me with a sneer that made my skin crawl as he decided to break the heavy silence with his usual brand of cruelty. He announced loudly enough for the waiters to hear that 33 was a significant age for someone from my background, insinuating that the life expectancy in the neighbourhood where I grew up was likely not much higher than that. I continued to eat, forcing myself to swallow the expensive meat that suddenly tasted like ash, while he continued to goad me about how far I had climbed from the gutter. It was a sore subject for the Sterlings that I had grown up in a small apartment on the south side, while they had been raised in gated mansions with staff to attend to their every whim. I had clawed my way out through scholarships and sleepless nights studying forensic accounting, while Darius had coasted through life on his mother's connections and checkbook. Genevieve offered a half-hearted reprimand to Chad, telling him to be nice because they were there to celebrate me, but her tone lacked any real authority. She raised her champagne glass and proposed a toast to the girl who proved that one could take the girl out of the struggle, but could never quite take the struggle out of the girl, a backhanded compliment that landed with the weight of a physical blow. Darius chuckled at his mother's cruelty, a low and nervous sound that broke my heart more than the insult itself, because I had spent 5 years protecting him from the very people who were now mocking me. I looked at him, silently begging him to defend his wife, to tell his mother that she was being vicious, but he just sipped his drink and kept his eyes fixed on the tablecloth like a coward. He was 35 years old, but in the presence of his mother, he reverted to a toddler who was terrified of losing his allowance. Bianca chimed in with a giggle, adjusting the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist that had been paid for by the company accounts I managed, and reminded everyone that I knew they were just joking. She insisted that one had to have thick skin to marry into the Sterling family, as if their cruelty was a quirky personality trait rather than a symptom of their moral rot. I took a sip of water and kept my voice steady, as I told her that I had thick skin because I dealt with financial fraud and corporate theft for a living. So insults from people who could not balance a checkbook did not faze me. The table went deadly silent at my retort, and Genevieve's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits as she realised her prey was not going to roll over and die quietly. Genevieve lowered her voice to a dangerous octave and asked if she was hearing gratitude or insolence, reminding me of the roof over my head, the car I drove, and the clothes on my back. She lectured me about how I walked around as if I'd earned these things, warning me not to forget who signed the checks that funded my existence. I wanted to scream that I was the one who had saved Sterling Properties from bankruptcy 3 years ago, when Chad had embezzled funds through a shell company. I wanted to scream that the roof over my head was paid for by the tax loopholes I'd found for them, and that the car I drove was 5 years old, while Chad drove a new Porsche leased on company credit. But I stayed silent, because I was a forensic accountant, and I knew that in any investigation, you do not show your hand until you have gathered every scrap of evidence. I apologised to Genevieve, keeping my voice neutral and submissive, telling her I was grateful for everything the family had exposed me to. She seemed satisfied with my submission and announced that because it was a milestone birthday, they had a milestone gift for me, reaching under the table to produce a large, thick manila envelope. She tossed the envelope onto the center of the table, where it landed with a heavy thud between the floral centerpiece and my untouched bread plate, the stark yellow paper looking out of place amidst the crystal and silver. Genevieve commanded me to open it, and as my fingers brushed the rough paper, I felt a strange vibration in the air, as if the entire restaurant had held its breath. Darius suddenly moved, pulling his phone out of his jacket pocket and holding it up with the camera lens pointing directly at my face, the red recording light blinking like a warning signal. I asked him in a whisper what he was doing, and he replied with a cruel smile that his mother said this was a memory they would want to keep forever. Chad leaned forward eagerly, goading me to see what Mummy and Daddy had bought me, betting that it was a one-way ticket back to the hood. I tore open the envelope and pulled out the stack of legal documents, the bold black letters at the top of the page punching me in the gut as I read the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." I froze as the words swam before my eyes, realizing they were serving me divorce papers on my birthday at a dinner party, while my husband recorded my reaction for a viral moment of humiliation. Genevieve clapped her hands together once and announced that they thought it was time to correct a mistake they had made 5 years ago, telling me that I had never truly belonged in their world. She called me a temporary lapse in judgment and a diversity hire for their family photo album, but declared that the contract was now up. I looked down at the papers, my eyes scanning the legal jargon with the speed of someone who reads contracts for a living, and realized the terms were a total annihilation of my future. I was to leave the marital home within 24 hours, I would receive 0 alimony, and I would have no claim to any future earnings of Sterling Properties. Bianca reminded me sweetly that I had signed a prenuptial agreement to ensure I would leave with nothing but my old clothes and my student loan debt. Chad laughed, a barking sound that echoed in the room, telling me it was nothing personal, just business, and that I was a bad investment that needed to be liquidated. I looked at Darius and whispered for him to say something, to tell me this was a sick joke, but he just lowered the phone slightly and told me that his mother was right. He told me I was boring because I was always talking about budgets and audits, and that he wanted a wife who knew how to spend money, not just count it. The cruelty of his words took my breath away, especially after I had spent 5 years cleaning up his messes, hiding his gambling debts, and fixing his credit score so he could pretend to be a functioning adult. Genevieve leaned forward with a triumphant look on her face and pointed out that there was a pen in the envelope, urging me to sign it immediately to save them the cost of a process server. She threatened that if I fought them, they would bury me in legal fees until I was living in a shelter, and I looked at the cheap plastic ballpoint pen she had provided. Inside my chest, my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and the humiliation burned hot and sharp on my face. But then, my training kicked in, and I remembered that I dealt with facts rather than feelings, and a single fact crystallized in my mind that changed everything. Genevieve had forgotten the paperwork she signed 3 years ago when the company was drowning and she needed to qualify for a government grant reserved for minority female-owned businesses. She had signed over 51% of the company stock to me, thinking it was just a nominee agreement she could discard later, but she had never read the fine print that made the transfer absolute and irrevocable. I looked at the divorce papers again and focused on paragraph 4, clause B, which stated clearly that all assets shall be divided according to legal title and ownership at the time of filing. A cold calm washed over me, starting at the base of my spine and spreading through my veins, turning my blood to ice as I realized she had just handed me the keys to the kingdom. I reached into my purse and bypassed the cheap pen, pulling out my own Mont Blanc fountain pen that I had bought for myself when I passed my certification exam. I uncapped the pen with a sharp click and told Genevieve that she was absolutely right, watching as Darius zoomed in on my face, expecting a breakdown. I told them that I did not belong there and that I had been trying to fit a square piece into a round hole for 5 years by teaching fiscal responsibility to people who thought money grew on trees. I laid the papers flat on the linen tablecloth, smoothed out the crease, and looked directly into the camera lens as I told Darius that this was not a punishment, but a liberation. I signed my name in dark, permanent ink, dated it, and even added the time as 8:42 in the evening. Chad stopped drinking, and Bianca's mouth fell open slightly, because they had expected a fight, begging, or a scene where I clung to their ankles as they kicked me out. I capped my pen and put it back in my bag, then stood up and brushed a non-existent crumb from my lap, before thanking them for the dinner and the gift. I told them that they had just saved me about $5,000 in legal retainers, because I had been planning to file the following week anyway, but I had not wanted to ruin the surprise. Darius dropped his phone onto the table with a clatter and asked if I was really going to file, his voice cracking with confusion. I confirmed that I had been planning this for months, but having him serve me first really simplified things because it proved abandonment and hostile intent. Genevieve stood up and demanded to know where I was going, insisting that I had to leave the keys and return the jewellery immediately. I laughed, a genuine sound, loud and clear, and told her the jewellery was fake department store outlet trash and she could keep it, adding that I would leave the keys on the counter when I moved out that night. As I turned to walk away, Chad yelled that I could not just walk out because I had company laptops and passwords, and they needed access to the accounts immediately. I stopped and looked back at the family, who had treated me like a servant for half a decade, and told them they should have thought about that before serving the chief financial officer with divorce papers during the middle of a tax audit. Chad's face went pale as he whispered to ask what audit, and I smiled as I informed him it was the one I had initiated that morning, wishing him luck with the Internal Revenue Service. I walked out of the private room and into the main dining area, hearing Genevieve screeching at Darius to do something and Chad cursing loudly behind me. I pushed through the heavy double doors into the humid Atlanta night, and as I waited for the valet, I checked my phone to find a voice note from Bianca sent 5 minutes prior. She sneered through the speaker that Chad had already called the locksmith and my belongings would be on the lawn by morning, wishing me luck finding a shelter that accepted trash. I deleted the message and got into my car, locking the doors and inhaling the scent of leather and freedom before opening my banking app. They thought locking me out of the house was a power move, but they had forgotten that I was the signatory on the deeds and the name on the bank accounts. My finger hovered over the transfer button as I realised they wanted a war, so I would give them an apocalypse. I pressed the button and watched the screen flash green as the transfer completed, freezing all corporate assets pending the audit I had fabricated as a cover for my revenge. I put the car in gear, deciding I wasn't going to the house, but rather to the Ritz-Carlton, where I would pay for the presidential suite with the company card one last time before the freeze took effect. Genevieve wanted her son to be single, and she wanted her company back. But while she got her son, she had just signed away her company, along with her dignity. I drove into the night, leaving the Sterlings to their expensive dinner and impending doom, knowing the real party was just getting started. The lobby of the Ritz-Carlton in Buckhead smelled faintly of white tea and old money, a scent that usually made me feel like an imposter in my own life, but tonight it smelled distinctly like victory. I walked to the front desk with my heels clicking on the marble floors in a rhythm that felt like a countdown to an explosion, ignoring the curious glances from the late-night staff. The night manager looked up and offered a polite smile, recognizing the exhausted woman in the expensive dress who often booked rooms for visiting investors. But I did not return the gesture, because I was no longer that woman. I simply slid the sleek black American Express Centurion card across the mahogany counter, the heavy metal clinking against the wood with a sound of authority. This was the company card meant for client entertainment and executive emergencies, and I figured my current situation of being homeless and divorced by my own family qualified as both. I requested the presidential suite for the week, keeping my voice devoid of any tremor, and instructed him to charge the maximum incidental hold because I planned on ordering a significant amount of room service. The manager swiped the card, and for a terrifying second, I held my breath, wondering if Genevieve had already managed to call the bank. But the machine chirped its approval. The freeze I had initiated on the operational accounts would take until midnight to fully propagate through the banking system, giving me a narrow window of opportunity that I intended to exploit to its absolute limit. I took the keycard and headed for the elevator, leaving the hushed sounds of the lobby behind as the doors slid shut and enclosed me in a mirrored silence where I finally allowed my shoulders to drop. As I ascended to the top floor, the vibration in my clutch became impossible to ignore, a digital heartbeat of rage coming from the people I had just walked away from. I entered the suite, which was larger than the first apartment Darius and I had shared, and kicked off my heels, letting them land wherever they fell on the plush carpet. I poured myself a glass of water from the crystal pitcher on the sidebar and finally sat down on the edge of the massive, king-sized bed to inspect the damage on my phone. The screen was a kaleidoscope of angry notifications consisting of 43 missed calls, 12 voicemails, and a stream of text messages that scrolled endlessly like a ticker tape of panic. I did not call them back or text a reply, but instead pressed play on the first voicemail from Bianca. Her voice screeched through the speaker, tiny and distorted with malice, asking if I thought I was smart, and informing me that Chad had already called the locksmith. She threatened that my belongings would be on the lawn by morning, and mocked me, saying I should have fun finding a shelter that accepted trash. I saved the message as evidence of illegal eviction and destruction of property, feeling a cold satisfaction as I moved to the next voicemail from Darius. The background noise was chaotic, with wind rushing past the microphone suggesting he was standing outside the restaurant while his mother screamed in the background. He begged me to pick up the phone and stop playing games, claiming that his mother was hyperventilating and that I needed to fix the situation immediately. He implored me to call the bank and unfreeze the accounts, promising that we could talk about the divorce terms and maybe reach a settlement if I just came back. I saved that one too, noting that he wasn't worried about me or our marriage, but rather he was terrified that the automated teller machine he had married was finally out of order. I set the phone down and walked over to the heavy oak desk by the window, where the view of the Atlanta skyline glittered with a million lights, but I only had eyes for my laptop. I opened it, and the screen illuminated my face in the darkened room as I plugged in my secure RSA token, the small device that generated the 6-digit codes necessary to access the financial heart of Sterling Properties. Genevieve thought she ran the company because her name was on the building, and Chad thought he ran it because he had the title of Chief Financial Officer. But in the modern world, the person who runs the company is the person who has the admin passwords. I logged into the cloud-based accounting system, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I executed a sequence of commands I had memorized years ago. I was logged in as the super administrator, a profile I had created when I overhauled their archaic bookkeeping system, and the dashboard loaded to show the company's cash flow in real time. It was bleeding money, because Chad had been siphoning funds out of the construction loans for months, moving it into shell accounts to cover his bad cryptocurrency investments. I could see it all clearly, the transfers sloppy and arrogant, hidden under vague line items like consulting fees and miscellaneous procurement. I navigated to the liquidity accounts, which held the funds meant for payroll, taxes, and operational costs, and opened a new transfer window. According to the employment contract I had drafted for myself 3 years ago, a contract Darius had signed without reading because he was too busy watching football, I was entitled to a severance package equivalent to 3 years of salary, plus the immediate vesting of my equity in the event of a hostile termination without cause. Serving me divorce papers at a birthday dinner, publicly humiliating me, and locking me out of my home definitely qualified as hostile termination, so I calculated the total and authorised the transfer. It was a substantial number that would drain their liquid reserves to dangerously low levels, moving the funds from the Sterling operating account into a secure escrow holding account under my name. The screen flashed a confirmation that the transaction was approved, but I wasn't done yet. I opened my email client and found a draft I had written weeks ago addressed to the Internal Revenue Service, specifically the Criminal Investigation Division. The subject line read, Supplemental Report Fiscal Year 2023, Potential irregularities in Sterling Properties LLC. I attached the PDF documents showing Chad's embezzlement, the scanned copies of Genevieve's personal expenses charged to the business accounts, and the falsified contractor invoices Bianca had submitted. I hovered my mouse over the send button, thinking about how I had protected them for 5 years, standing as a shield between their greed and the consequences of their actions. I thought about Darius recording me with his phone, waiting for my tears, and I clicked send, watching the email vanish into the digital ether straight to the federal government. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion, so I stood up and walked to the minibar to take out a small bottle of champagne. I popped the cork and poured it into a glass, walking to the window to toast the city lights and whispering a happy birthday to myself. While I settled into the silence of the hotel suite across town, the Sterling mansion was loud with the noise of premature celebration, a fact I knew because I had installed the smart home security system myself. I opened my laptop and pulled up the live feed from the living room camera, the audio crisp and the video definition strictly 4,000 pixels. Darius and Chad were in the main salon, sprawled out on the Italian leather sofas I had picked out, the air thick with cigar smoke and the clinking of crystal. They had raided the wine cellar, opening bottles of vintage Bordeaux that Geneviève had been saving for a wedding anniversary she would likely never see. Darius held his glass up to the light, swirling the dark red liquid with a look of sloppy intoxication, and slurred that he had never felt so light. He confessed that he had loved me in the beginning, but that I was just so heavy, always talking about responsibility and watching every dime he spent. Chad laughed and kicked his feet up onto the coffee table, something I never allowed him to do, and took a long drag from his cigar before blowing smoke toward the ceiling. He told Darius that he had dodged a bullet because I was a drag who never understood how people like them operated. He claimed I thought I was the boss just because I knew how to use Excel, and insisted that Darius needed a wife who knew her place and appreciated the Sterling name. Bianca walked into the frame carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres she had likely ordered from the country club, looking flushed and triumphant. She announced that her mother was in the study, calling all her friends to tell them Darius had finally come to his senses and dumped the help. Darius grilled her about a party, saying it sounded amazing, but complained that the wine was too dry and he wanted the expensive gold bottle champagne. He fumbled for his phone to order 3 cases from the cellar delivery service, tapping the screen with clumsy fingers and declaring that tonight they would drink like kings. I watched as he navigated the app, his thumb hovering over the purchase button and then pressing it. A second passed, then another. And Darius frowned as he tapped the screen harder, muttering that it said, "Payment declined." Chad snorted and sat up, suggesting that Darius had probably maxed out the card on a watch, or that I'd reported it stolen just to be petty. He told Darius to move over and let a real chief financial officer handle it, pulling out his heavy metal platinum business card with a flourish. Chad took the phone and entered his card details, hitting the button with confidence. But the silence that followed was delicious. He stared at the phone as his smirk vanished, replaced by genuine confusion, and announced that it said declined and to contact the issuer immediately. Bianca asked how both cards could be declined, since she had seen the statement and the bill was paid, her voice rising in pitch. Chad declared there must be a glitch in the app, or the fraud detection algorithm was too sensitive, and decided to call the concierge line to clear it up in 2 seconds. I watched him dial the number and put on my headphones to hear the other end of the call clearly through the high-fidelity audio pickup. Chad barked into the phone that he was the CFO of Sterling Properties and demanded the hold be lifted immediately, expecting the usual sycophantic service. However, the voice on the other end was cold, professional, and detached, asking him to verify his social security number and the tax ID of the business for security purposes. Chad rattled off the numbers impatiently, insisting he did not have time for 20 questions, but the representative cut him off with a tone of finality. The representative informed him that the card could not be reactivated because the account had been flagged for liquidation and audit. Chad demanded to know what he was talking about, and the representative explained that all credit lines associated with Sterling properties had been suspended, effective immediately, pending a forensic review. The colour drained from Chad's face as he whispered the word, audit, looking at Darius, who was sobering up instantly. Chad screamed into the phone, asking who authorised an audit, and the representative replied that the authorisation came from the primary account holder and majority shareholder. The line went dead, and Chad lowered the phone slowly, looking like he had seen a ghost, as he told Darius that the accounts were frozen and the majority shareholder had ordered a forensic audit. Genevieve chose that moment to sweep into the room, beaming and holding a glass of sherry, announcing that the senator's wife was thrilled Darius was single again. Darius stood up on unsteady legs and told his mother that the credit cards were not working and the bank said the accounts were frozen. Genevieve's smile evaporated as she dismissed the idea, claiming she had used the card an hour ago. But Chad insisted that they said the majority shareholder ordered it. Genevieve laughed sharply and declared that was impossible because she was the majority shareholder, insisting it was a computer error. She marched over to the antique desk where the dedicated landline to their private wealth manager sat and dialed Arthur, hitting the speaker button so everyone could hear him apologise. She snapped at Arthur that there was incompetence in his credit department and demanded he fix it immediately or she would have his job. There was a long silence on the line before Arthur spoke, his voice sounding tired and strangely distant as he told her that he could not fix it. He explained that the order came from the compliance department and his hands were tied, but Genevieve shrieked that she was his biggest client. Arthur quietly corrected her, stating that she was not his biggest client anymore, and that she hadn't signed a cheque that cleared in 3 years. He told her to check her corporate charter and reminded her of the tax incentives from 3 years ago that required 51% ownership by a minority woman. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, watching the blood drain from Genevieve's face as she remembered the day she had begged me to sign the papers to save the company from Chad's debts. She had called it a nominee agreement and promised a side letter to give her the power back, but she had been too lazy and arrogant to ever draft it. Arthur continued, explaining that he had reviewed the documents that evening and the transfer was absolute, unconditional, and irrevocable. The room went silent, the only sound being the hum of the refrigerator and the heavy breathing of 4 people realising their lives were over. Genevieve slumped into the desk chair and whispered that I was her daughter-in-law and I wouldn't do this. But Arthur confirmed that I had exercised my right to freeze all assets. He informed her that I had flagged transactions going back 5 years, including the renovation on her lake house and Chad's crypto withdrawals. The word audit hung in the air like a guillotine blade as Genevieve begged Arthur to help them. But he told her that if the IRS saw the books, he could not help. He revealed that he had already received a subpoena and had to turn over the files, advising her that his lawyer had told him to sever all contact before hanging up. The busy signal echoed through the opulent room like a countdown, and Chad dropped onto the sofa with his head in his hands, moaning that they were going to jail. He realised that as an accountant, I knew where all the bodies were buried, and Darius begged his mother to say it wasn't true. Genevieve stared at the phone receiver as if it were a snake, whispering that she thought I was stupid and would just do whatever she told me. Bianca started crying and wailing about her allowance and how she would pay for her trainer, while Genevieve stood up slowly, looking suddenly old and frail. She said they needed the best lawyer in Atlanta and would sue me, claiming I tricked her. But Chad asked with what money, since the accounts were frozen. Genevieve frantically looked around the room at the expensive furniture and suggested they had assets like the house and jewellery. But Chad reminded her dully that the company owned the house, which meant I owned the house. Genevieve let out a sound that was half scream and half sob, grabbing a crystal vase and hurling it across the room where it shattered against the fireplace. She screamed that I'd done this on purpose, planning it while I sat at dinner and smiled, realising too late that the woman they had mocked was their executioner. I closed my laptop, having seen enough to know that tomorrow the real work would begin with the FBI. But for tonight, I poured the last of the champagne and slept the sleep of the just, while nobody in the mansion across town slept at all. The ringtone cut through the silence of the presidential suite like a fire alarm at 2 in the morning, jarring me from my peaceful vigil on the balcony, where I stood wrapped in a plush white robe, watching the traffic on Peachtree Road far below. The bottle of champagne was half empty, and for the first time in 5 years, my shoulders were not hunched with the crushing tension of trying to please people who could not be pleased. I looked at the phone screen to see Darius's name flashing, and I let it ring once, twice, then 3 times because I wanted him to sit in that silence and feel the distance between us. A distance no longer measured in miles, but in power dynamics. Finally, I swiped the screen and put the phone on speaker, setting it down on the glass table beside my champagne flute as I greeted him with a voice that was calm, almost bored, the same voice I used for difficult tax auditors. Darius sounded like a wet, frantic mess, his speech slurring with the heavy, jagged breathing of a man who had consumed too much vintage wine and realized too late that it was poison. He begged me to stop this, claiming that it was not funny anymore and that his mother was losing her mind, throwing things and breaking antique vases in the hallway. He implored me to fix it, to call the bank and tell them it was a mistake. But I took a slow sip of champagne and let the bubbles fizz on my tongue before informing him that there was no mistake. I explained that the bank was simply following protocol because when a majority shareholder suspects embezzlement and fraud, it is their fiduciary duty to freeze assets. A fact he should know, since he paid for a business degree, even if he never used it. He tried to argue, shouting that I should not give him that corporate speak because I was not the majority shareholder, but merely the help, insisting that the paper I signed 3 years ago was just a technicality to help his mother get a government contract. I laughed, a low and dry sound that seemed to confuse him, and asked if that was what Genevieve told herself, so she could sleep at night while treating me like garbage. I leaned closer to the phone, dropping my voice to a whisper that was far more dangerous than a scream, and refreshed his memory about that night in the library 3 years ago, when Chad was crying on the sofa because he had lost $2 million on a crypto scam. I reminded him that the company was insolvent, payroll checks were about to bounce, and Genevieve was on her knees on the Persian rug, begging me to save the sterling legacy. She needed a minority woman to head the company to qualify for the emergency relief grant, and she needed a face that looked like mine to clean up the mess that looked like Chad. I reminded him that she transferred 51% of the stock to me, and while she claimed it was a nominee agreement, she was too cheap to hire an external lawyer to draft a complex trust, so she used a standard transfer form she downloaded from the internet. I told him there was no side letter, no sunset clause, and no trust agreement. Just a deed filed with the Secretary of State, transferring the company irrevocably to me. The silence on the other end was heavy and suffocating, as the reality of his mother's arrogance settled over him like a shroud. I told him that I had tried to warn her that the language was too broad, and she was giving away the kingdom. But she had told me to shut up and sign, claiming I was lucky to even have my name on a sterling document. So I signed. I saved the company. I secured the grant, and I waited for 5 years to be treated like a partner or a wife. But instead, I got insults and exclusion. I thanked him for the divorce papers because they were the final piece of the puzzle, instructing him to go find them and look at the asset division section his mother had bragged was ironclad. I heard him fumbling with paper while Genevieve screamed in the background, and I directed him to paragraph 4, section C, commanding him to read it out loud. He read the words trembling, stating that all marital assets and business interests shall be divided strictly according to the legal title and ownership records on file with the state at the time of filing. I asked if he understood what that meant, explaining that his mother wrote a prenuptial agreement to protect herself from me because she thought she owned everything, but she forgot who legally owned the company. Thanks to her own legal drafting, I did not even have to split the company with him because it was my separate property acquired via business transfer, and since he had filed the papers, the terms were locked. Darius screamed that I could not do this because it was his family legacy that his grandfather had built, but I corrected him by saying his mother broke it, Chad looted it, I saved it, and now I owned it. He tried to pivot to emotional manipulation, telling me that he was single and broke, pleading that he would fire Chad and put his mother in a home if I just came back because he loved me. I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of sadness not for the loss of him, but for the realization that his love was like his business sense, cheap, performative, and ultimately worthless. I told him that he did not love me, but rather he loved the lifestyle I maintained for him and the safety net I provided. But that net was gone, and he was in free fall. He panicked when I said I was going to hang up, asking what they were supposed to do without cash or credit cards. And I suggested he ask Genevieve, since she thought she was the smartest person in the room. Then I dropped the other shoe, revealing that Chad had a secret crypto wallet with about $200,000 he had skimmed from the renovation budget for the Buckhead condo project, suggesting they ask him about that before the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived. Darius whispered the acronym in horror, and I confirmed that I had sent the email at midnight, cutting a deal for whistleblower protection by handing over all evidence of Chad's embezzlement and Genevieve's tax evasion. I told him I didn't send them to prison, their greed did, and then I ended the call, turning off the lights to sleep without dreaming of drowning for the first time in a decade. The conference room on the 45th floor of Henderson & Associates smelled of mahogany polish and intimidation, designed specifically to make people feel small. But I walked in precisely at 9 in the morning, wearing a tailored crimson suit that screamed of power and warning signs. Genevieve sat at the head of the massive oval table, looking like she had spent the morning trying to repair the damage to her appearance, though the stress lines around her mouth were deep and undeniable. Darius sat to her right, looking like a man waiting for a sentencing hearing, while Bianca nervously scrolled on her phone, and Chad sat with his legs crossed, displaying an unearned confidence that was typical of a mediocre man who had failed upward his entire life. Mr. Henderson, the senior partner who cost $800 an hour, stood up and gestured for me to take the lone chair on the opposite side of the table, stating that his clients had retained him to address the severe breach of trust and potential criminal misappropriation of assets. I sat down and placed my leather portfolio on the table without opening it, folding my hands and telling him I was listening. Henderson cleared his throat and opened a thick file, arguing that the share transfer 3 years ago was made under duress and was a nominal arrangement, threatening to file an injunction and a civil suit for conversion of funds unless I returned the money and shares immediately. Chad could not help himself and leaned forward to mansplain the situation, his voice dripping with condescension as he told me that, while I was good with a calculator, corporate law and high finance were different animals. He stood up and walked to the whiteboard, lecturing me about piercing the corporate veil and commingling assets, claiming that by freezing the accounts, I had triggered liquidity covenants that would bankrupt the company. He chuckled and shook his head, telling me he understood that I saw a lot of zeros and got excited, but wealth management required a pedigree I did not possess. He offered me a deal where I would sign the papers, give back the keys, and walk away with my credit score intact, advising me to go back to doing taxes for small businesses and leave the empire building to the men. I waited a beat, letting the silence stretch until Henderson shifted uncomfortably, and then asked quietly if Chad was finished. I unzipped my portfolio slowly, the sound loud in the quiet room, and pulled out a single stack of documents paper-clipped together, sliding them across the polished table until they stopped right in front of Mr. Henderson. I addressed the lawyer, assuming that as an officer of the court, he had a duty to report any knowledge of ongoing felonies committed by his clients, specifically money laundering and wire fraud. Henderson frowned and asked me to explain, so I turned my gaze to Chad and brought up the West Side Revitalization Project, a $20 million government grant earmarked for affordable housing that was the flagship project for Sterling Properties. I reminded Genevieve that she had cut the ribbon and cried on the local news about giving back to the community, and she looked confused, agreeing it was a beautiful ceremony. I pointed to the documents in front of Henderson and directed him to page 3, showing a series of wire transfers totaling $2,300,000, authorized by Chad Miller acting as CFO. I explained that these transfers were sent to a consulting firm called Zenith Solutions, based in the Cayman Islands. And Chad jumped up, shouting that it was a legitimate vendor for architectural consulting. I snapped at him to sit down, my voice cracking like a whip, and continued to explain that Zenith Solutions had exactly one employee, a woman named Svetlana, who incidentally shared an address with an online crypto gambling exchange. Darius looked up with wide eyes as I turned the page to show the money flowing from Zenith Solutions into a personal crypto wallet that was used to purchase a bright yellow Lamborghini Urus and lease a penthouse apartment for a 22-year-old Instagram model named Kiki. Bianca let out a strangled sound and grabbed the photo of the SUV, screaming at Chad that he had told her the car was a company lease and that he was working late at the office. Chad yelled that I had forged the documents and was trying to frame him. But I calmly told Henderson to look at the metadata, the IP addresses, and the authorization signatures, which were all Chad's. I explained that embezzling $2 million from a federal housing grant was wire fraud and money laundering, carrying a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. I leaned forward and told Chad that he had tried to explain finance to me, but he was the confused one, because forensic accounting was about finding the threads arrogant people left behind. I turned back to Henderson and revealed that I had already prepared a digital packet containing all this evidence, plus the tax evasion schemes Genevieve had signed off on. Genevieve gasped that she didn't know, claiming Chad told her it was creative accounting, but I reminded her that ignorance was not a defense when she signed the returns, despite my memos warning her it was fraud. I stood up and smoothed my skirt, telling Henderson that while he asked me to sign over the shares, the reality was that I was the majority shareholder of a company that was currently a crime scene. I told him the only reason I hadn't gone to the FBI yet was because I wanted to see if he was smart enough to save himself from representing a criminal enterprise. I warned him that if he continued to advocate for them or intimidate a whistleblower, he would become part of the conspiracy and could lose his license or go to jail. The room was dead silent as Henderson closed the file, stood up, and picked up his briefcase. Ignoring Genevieve's pleas for him to arrest me, he looked at her with pure disgust and terminated his representation effective immediately, advising Chad to save every penny for a criminal defense attorney who specialized in federal indictments. He looked at me and nodded once, a gesture of respect from one shark to another, before walking out of the room. I was alone with them, the silence thick with fear, and Genevieve trembled as she whispered that I wouldn't send family to prison. I zipped my portfolio and told her that family didn't give you divorce papers for your birthday or steal from the poor to buy sports cars for mistresses. I checked my watch and told them I had a meeting with the FBI in 1 hour, giving them 60 minutes to decide if they wanted to do this the hard way or the fatal way, and walked out to the sound of Chad crying. Back in the sanctuary of the hotel suite, I refilled my glass with the last of the champagne and maximized the window on my laptop screen to watch the fallout. The camera feed from the Sterling Mansion living room was crystal clear, playing out like a silent film of a shipwreck where the passengers were just realizing there were no lifeboats. They had returned from the lawyer's office in a silence that must have been suffocating, and now they stood in the main salon, looking at the wreckage of their lives amidst the custom furniture and expensive art. Genevieve was the first to break the tableau, walking over to the sideboard to pour herself a drink with a hand that shook so violently the crystal decanter rattled against the glass like chattering teeth. She downed the amber liquid in one desperate gulp before turning slowly to look at Chad, who was trying to make himself small on the sofa he had so arrogantly claimed earlier. He had lost all his swagger, the unearned confidence that usually radiated off him like heat waves, replaced by the clammy sweat of a man who knows he is cornered in a room with no exits. Genevieve spoke in a voice that was low and barely a whisper, yet the high-fidelity audio picked it up perfectly as she accused him of stealing $2 million from the affordable housing grant. Chad looked up with eyes darting around the room as if searching for a magical escape hatch, stammering that it was an investment and he had intended to pay it back. He tried to spin a narrative where he needed liquidity to leverage a position in the market, claiming it was a sure thing he had done for the family. But Genevieve was not listening to his delusions anymore. She walked toward him with slow, deliberate steps, reminding him that he had bought a Lamborghini and rented an apartment for a girl younger than her daughter, asking if those were also for the family. Chad stood up, trying to regain some height and authority, insisting that I was twisting the narrative and manipulating the data. He begged for access to the offshore accounts, claiming that if she gave him the codes, he could move assets around to cover the hole before the audit went deep. Genevieve stopped right in front of him, looking 10 feet tall despite her stature, and screamed that there were no offshore accounts because I had frozen them all. She slapped him then, a heavy and violent blow that echoed through the speakers, screaming that he had handed me the gun and loaded it for me. Bianca shrieked and rushed to her husband's side, glaring at her mother and yelling that it was not his fault because he was just stressed, before spinning around to point a manicured finger at Darius. Bianca unleashed her fury on her brother, screaming that this was entirely his fault because he was the one who had married me and brought a snake into their house. She accused him of being weak, of letting me take over the books, and of being too busy playing golf to realize I was gathering ammunition to destroy them. She spat that if he had been a real husband who kept his wife in check, I would never have had the power to do this, blaming him for letting a girl from the gutter take down their legacy because he was too lazy to read the contracts he signed. I watched Darius recoil as if he had been physically struck, looking to his mother for defense, but Genevieve just stared at him with cold, hard eyes that confirmed she agreed with Bianca's assessment. Darius muttered that he was going to fix it, pulling out his phone and declaring that he would talk to me because he believed I still loved him. He walked out of the living room and onto the terrace, needing privacy to work his charm, and I watched him leave the frame on my laptop screen, just as my phone lit up on the bed beside me with an incoming call from him. I let it go to voicemail, wanting him to sweat, wanting him to feel the desperation clawing at his throat before I delivered the final blow. A minute later, my phone chimed with a text message where he begged me to pick up, apologizing profusely and claiming that his mother had pressured him into the divorce papers. He promised to go to therapy and do whatever I wanted if I would just stop the audit and come home, trying to gaslight me one last time by rewriting history to paint himself as a victim. I read the words and felt a wave of nausea at the predictability of his manipulation, knowing he thought he could charm the woman who had once forgiven him for everything. But that woman was dead, and I needed to show him the corpse, so I opened my encrypted folder and scrolled past the financial documents to the folder labelled Miami. I selected a single, high-resolution photo taken a month ago outside the W Hotel in South Beach, showing Darius with his arms wrapped around his 22-year-old executive assistant, his hand resting low on her hip while they laughed like a couple in love. I attached the photo to the text thread and typed a simple message telling him not to perform for me because I was not his mother, and informing him that his assistant's employment was terminated effective immediately, as I was cutting unnecessary overhead. I hit send and looked back at the laptop screen to see Darius standing on the terrace, illuminated by the outdoor security lights, watching his body go rigid as he stared at his phone. He slumped against the railing and dropped the phone onto the patio table, putting his hands over his face as he crouched on the ground. Not crying because he lost me, but because he had been caught. My phone buzzed again with a text asking how long I had known, and I replied immediately that I had known since the day he booked the flight, because I had installed a keylogger on his laptop. I told him I had seen every email, every chat message, and every piece of jewellery he bought her with the bonus I had earned for him. I watched him read it and look around wildly, staring right into the security camera lens as if he could feel my gaze, and I waved at the screen before typing a final goodbye. He stormed back into the house looking like a man who had seen his own execution, whispering to his mother that I knew everything about Ashley and that I was never coming back. Genevieve closed her eyes in exhaustion and called him a sloppy, careless fool, and just like that, the alliance broke completely as the room erupted into shouting and blaming. I waited until noon the next day to make the call, wanting them to spend the morning staring at their frozen bank accounts and the empty driveway where the repossessed cars used to be. I sat in the living area of the presidential suite with a room service breakfast untouched beside me, checking my appearance in the webcam to ensure I looked like a chief executive officer who had already won. I initiated the video call to the main line in the Sterling Mansion library, and the screen filled instantly with the image of the family huddled around the computer like survivors on a life raft. The contrast was striking. I looked fresh and expensive in a white silk blouse, while they looked wrecked, with Genevieve wearing stained clothes and Chad looking like he was choking. I greeted them cheerfully, asking if everyone slept well, and Genevieve flinched, rasping that I was a monster for letting the marshals take the cars while the neighbours watched. I took a sip of orange juice and remarked that humiliation depended on perspective, noting that I had found it quite humiliating when she handed me divorce papers in front of a waiter, but I imagined she would get over the loss of her G-Wagon eventually. Chad interrupted, his voice rough with desperation, telling me they had fired Henderson and were ready to make a deal, offering to liquidate the vacation homes to get me cash if I called off the dogs. I leaned back and steeped my fingers, informing him that I did not want the vacation homes because they were already mine as company assets, and I did not want his cash because he had none. Darius asked desperately what I wanted, and I looked at the fear in their eyes, remembering the years of insults and the way they made me feel small. I told them I wanted a public apology and a restitution of my reputation to correct the record after 5 years of them calling me a charity case. I demanded they rent the grand ballroom at the St. Regis for that Saturday night and invite everyone who mattered in the city for a transition of power ceremony. Genevieve asked suspiciously what would happen at the party, and I explained she would give a speech thanking me for saving the company and announcing her resignation due to health reasons. Chad asked what they would get in return for kissing the ring, and I promised that if they did exactly as I said, I would not send the final evidence file to the Federal Bureau of Investigation on Monday morning. They looked at each other, trapped and desperate, calculating that a party was manageable and that if they could just get me in a room, they might be able to fix the situation. They had no idea I was asking for a witness list rather than an ego stroke, so Genevieve agreed to the terms, promising to throw the party and be nice. I made them promise that if I sensed even a hint of disrespect, the deal was off, and Darius begged me not to press send on the email. I reiterated that I would not send it on Monday as long as the party went exactly as planned, a statement that was technically true because I had already met with the FBI that morning. I ended the call and stood by the window looking at the St. Regis in the distance, knowing that I wasn't going to the FBI on Monday, because I had given Agent Miller everything at 7 that morning. I had told him about the party, suggesting that if he wanted a splashy arrest with all suspects in one room, he should come to the ballroom at 9 in the evening. The party wasn't for my ego. It was for efficiency, to have the world see the Sterling family in handcuffs in their evening gowns. I spent the rest of the day preparing, drafting a speech and organising a PowerPoint presentation that Genevieve thought would be a slideshow of memories, but was actually a forensic map of her crimes. I organised the slides meticulously, embedding bank statements, highlighting illegal transfers in bright yellow, and including the photo of the Lamborghini. As the sun set, I felt a strange peace, realising the fear I had lived in for years was gone, replaced by a cold, hard purpose. I thought about Darius and almost felt pity for him as collateral damage in his mother's war. But then I remembered the text messages to his mistress and the video he took at the restaurant. Saturday arrived, and the grand ballroom at the St. Regis was a cavern of crystal and gold, smelling of white lilies and expensive desperation. Genevieve had liquidated her last personal jewellery to pay for the night, filling the room with senators and real estate moguls, trying to maintain the facade of the Sterling dynasty. I watched from the shadows of the mezzanine, adjusting the earpiece connected to the high-gain microphones I had planted in the floral arrangements. I heard Genevieve lying to a group of investors, telling them I was stepping back for my health because I was fragile, and I whispered the word fragile to myself with a dark smile. Darius and Chad stood near the bar, looking like men waiting for a firing squad, with Chad sweating and checking his phone for a miracle that wasn't coming. I signalled the lighting technician I had bribed, and the lights dimmed as a single spotlight hit the double doors at the top of the grand staircase. I stepped into the light, wearing a blood-red silk gown that clung to my body like a second skin, a dress that was a declaration of war against Genevieve's rules. The room went silent as 300 heads turned to look at me, barely recognizing the quiet accountant in the woman who was now the main event. I descended the staircase slowly, locking eyes with Genevieve and seeing the blood drain from her face as she realized I was not there to surrender. I walked through the crowd, my head held high, and approached the family who were huddled together in a knot of fear. Genevieve recovered first, stepping forward with a fake embrace and hissing in my ear that I was trying to upstage her and threatening to ruin me if I didn't stick to the script. I pulled back and smiled for the cameras, thanking her loudly for the compliment before Chad stepped up beside Darius. He covered his mouth with his hand, but my microphones picked up every syllable as he whispered to Darius that they should let me have my moment. He revealed his plan to have security grab me as soon as I resigned, claiming he had planted cocaine in my purse in the coat check, and they would drag me out the back door. He said they would tell the police I was a drug addict extorting them, and that nobody would believe me over the Sterling family. I didn't flinch or react, simply smiling, as I realized they were still playing checkers while I was playing three-dimensional chess. They thought planting drugs would save them, not realizing the FBI agents I had invited were currently standing at the bar, disguised as waiters. I looked right into Chad's watery, weak eyes and commented that he looked sweaty, asking if it was the heat of the moment. He sneered and told me to enjoy my walk because it was a long way down, while Darius stared at me with a mixture of lust and terror, whispering that I looked beautiful. I cut him off cold as ice, telling him he lost the right to compliment me when he tried to record my heartbreak for likes. I turned away from them and walked toward the stage where the podium waited, the click of my heels sounding like gunshots on the dance floor. Genevieve hurried to the side of the stage to signal the audiovisual team to start the tribute video she had prepared, nodding at me with a manic look in her eyes. I walked up the steps and stood behind the podium, gripping the cool wood as I looked out at the sea of faces, the wealthy and the corrupt who were all watching me. I saw Chad signalling to the head of security, a burly man moving toward the stage to execute their trap, but they were too late. I reached into my clutch and pulled out not a resignation speech, but a small remote control. And as I looked down at Genevieve's smug smile, I pressed the button. The screen behind me flickered, the sappy tribute video vanishing in a burst of static, to be replaced by a magnified image of a bank statement that loomed 10 feet tall over the ballroom. I leaned into the microphone, my voice amplified to fill every corner of the room, and announced that I was not there to resign, but to report a crime. The collective gasp from the audience sucked the oxygen out of the room as I used the remote to highlight the wire transfer of $2 million sent to a personal crypto wallet registered to Chad Miller. I explained with the cool detachment of a weather reporter predicting a hurricane that the money had originated from the Affordable Housing Grant, a federal fund meant for the poor that had instead purchased luxury cars and penthouse leases. I watched Chad freeze, his face draining of colour until he looked like old ash, while Genevieve's hand flew to her mouth in a gesture of theatrical shock that fooled absolutely no one. I pressed the button again, shifting the image to a complex digital flowchart that mapped the financial cancer of the Sterling Empire, showing bright red lines connecting corporate accounts to offshore shell companies in the Cook Islands. I narrated the flow of stolen capital, pointing out where millions in charitable donations had been routed into private real estate holdings in Europe under pseudonyms, effectively accusing Genevieve of tax evasion and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The room erupted into chaos as investors frantically pulled out their phones to call their lawyers, and the press photographers went into a frenzy, their flashes lighting up the stage like a strobe light. I raised my hand to command attention for one final announcement, asking the room if they wondered why a majority shareholder would publicly destroy her own company. I smiled the smile of the woman who had signed divorce papers at dinner and revealed that I was no longer the majority shareholder because, exactly 12 hours ago, I had exercised my right to sell my entire 51% stake. Darius stood up and shouted in confusion, and I looked down at him with a mixture of pity and contempt as I announced that I had sold my controlling interest to Vanguard Development, the Sterling family's fiercest rival. I let the silence return, heavier than before, as I delivered the punchline that I had sold the company for $1 and the assumption of all corporate liabilities. I explained that Vanguard specialized in distressed assets and would strip the company for parts, leaving the minority shareholders, Genevieve, Darius, and Chad, with absolutely nothing but worthless stock and insurmountable debt. Genevieve screamed, overturning her chair as she lunged toward the stage with her hands curled into claws, her black velvet gown tangling around her legs. Chad shouted for security to arrest me, claiming I had ruined them. But the side doors burst open to reveal not hotel security, but a phalanx of agents in blue windbreakers emblazoned with the letters FBI. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as the agents swarmed the front row, moving with military precision to intercept the crumbling dynasty. Chad tried to scramble over the table, scattering crystal glasses and centerpieces in a pathetic attempt to flee. But two agents slammed him face first into a plate of untouched salmon before cuffing his hands behind his back. An agent barked that he was under arrest for wire fraud and money laundering, while another team approached Genevieve, who stood trembling as they recited her rights and clicked the handcuffs onto her wrists. She looked back at the crowd, at the society friends she had tried to impress, and saw them taking photos of her ruin, realizing that her life as a queen of Atlanta was over. Darius was left sitting alone in the front row, not smart enough to be part of the crimes, but collateral damage nonetheless, tears streaming down his face as he watched his mother and brother-in-law being dragged away. I stepped back from the podium and nodded to the lead agent, who confirmed loud enough for the front row to hear that my whistleblower agreement was processed and I was free to go. I walked down the side stairs, bypassing the hysterical Bianca and the shell-shocked investors, and exited through the kitchen where the staff looked like they were enjoying the show more than anyone else. I walked out to the loading dock where my valet was waiting with my 5-year-old sedan, a car that wasn't a Lamborghini but was fully paid for and legally mine. I drove away from the street, Regis without looking back at the flashing blue lights converging on the entrance, heading north toward the airport and a new life, leaving the Sterlings to the ashes of the world they had tried to burn me with. 6 months later, the aftershocks of that night were still reshaping the landscape of Atlanta, and I read the news of the sentencing while drinking coffee on the balcony of my new penthouse. Genevieve and Chad had pleaded guilty to 34 counts of fraud and conspiracy, their high-priced defense team crumbling under the weight of the evidence I had provided. The judge sentenced them to 10 years in federal prison, calling their actions a gross violation of public trust. And I looked at the courtroom sketches, showing Genevieve stripped of her arrogance, just a frail woman in a grey suit, who was now merely a number. The collateral damage was total, as Vanguard Development moved quickly to liquidate Sterling properties, tearing down the office building to make way for a shopping complex and erasing the family name from the skyline. The government seized everything obtained through fraud, including the mansion, which was foreclosed upon and auctioned off to strangers who picked over the silver Genevieve had prized so highly. Bianca was living on a friend's couch, her social media silence a testament to her fall, while Darius had been left to navigate a world where his last name was a curse rather than a credit card. I saw him a week ago while walking through the Lenox Square Mall, spotting him through the glass window of a mid-range shoe store that smelled of rubber and discount polish. He was kneeling on the floor, fitting a sneaker onto the foot of a screaming toddler, wearing a uniform polo shirt that was a size too small, and looking like a man who had aged a decade in 6 months. He looked up, and our eyes met, and for a second he froze, seeing the tailored suit I was wearing and the confidence in my posture. I didn't wave or smile, feeling neither joy nor sadness, just a profound indifference toward the stranger who sold shoes, and I turned and walked away. 2 weeks ago, I received a check from the United States Treasury for $2 million, my whistleblower award for recovering the stolen assets, a sum larger than Darius had ever earned in his life. I didn't buy a sports car or a vacation home, but instead invested the money in opening my own firm called Sterling Shield, keeping the name because I had earned it. We were a boutique financial consultancy exclusively for women, specializing in premarital asset protection and forensic audits for divorce proceedings, helping women who were being gaslit by their partners about money. My waiting list was already 3 months long, filled with women who needed a shield and a weapon, and I sat with them to find the truth hidden in the numbers. As I sat in my new office on the 35th floor, watching the sun set over the city, my phone vibrated on the reclaimed wood desk with an incoming call from Darius. I watched the name flash on the screen, wondering if he wanted money, forgiveness, or just to hear the voice of the woman who used to organize his life. I took a sip of sparkling water and let it ring, deciding that he was no longer worth my energy because indifference was the ultimate revenge. The ringing stopped, the screen went dark, and I turned back to my computer to open a file for a new client, knowing that I was finally the CEO of my own life and business was good.